Okay, we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're calling from. Great to see that there are already people on the chat. So thank you for coming. As you all know, this is a new podcast and something that I think is really going to help people improve how they interact with other people in China, especially if you're non-Chinese. So if you want to say anything in the chat, say hello. Hopefully you've listened to all of the episodes, but what we really want to talk about today is episode 4. Okay, so if you started from the beginning, we started talking about how different levels of guanxi are developed, and we talked about Li Yi consideration that really affects how Chinese people approach developing guanxi relationships. And we talked about some of the different people that I've developed guanxi with based on different hierarchical considerations. So in episode 4, which is titled Trust During the Honeymoon Period, but I actually changed it to Art of War Deception During the Honeymoon Period, because we're really talking about when I was a China expat or a paratrooper manager and what happened during my experience leading local Chinese people. So one of the things that we always talk about is when you are a foreigner and you are dropped into China as an expat, before people know you and know what you stand for, there's going to be some default biases against you. Okay. One is they're not going to perceive you as qualified to really do the job, especially if you have to speak to a translator. But because you're a foreigner and they don't think you really understand how to do business in China, there's going to be skepticism of your qualifications. But the even worse part is a lot of people, especially if they report directly to you or they're people that indirectly you have to work with, they are always going to feel threatened because they think that you're going to change something that may adversely affect what they currently have going on. Okay. So there are several concepts that are really important for us to highlight in this episode. And they basically deal with cultural dichotomies between we as Westerners, or in my case, as an American, and how Chinese people think and behave and what they believe, okay? And in this episode, we really wanted to highlight these cultural dichotomies. One is the dichotomy of trust. The other is the dichotomy of truth. And then the final one that I think is really important is the cultural dichotomy of truth default, which comes from a book by Dr. Timothy Levine. He wrote a book called Duped that really describes why we as Westerners are so easily deceived, okay? Because we have a truth default to trust people we don't know. Now, that's actually the opposite in China, okay? So before we really get into Richard and what some of his actions were, but more importantly, how we could have, number one, detected those actions or what he was thinking or what he was planning, and two, what we could have actually done to help him change course or change what he wanted to get out of the relationship. Okay. So first, what is the cultural dichotomy of truth? Okay. So this is really basic. In Western culture, we think truth comes from honesty. We think truth is based on facts and figures. And we talk about things like it's a hard truth. That means we think that whatever we think is true is not up for debate. Okay. That's what we call absolute truth. In China, the way that the Chinese mind works is they think in relative truths. That means in a different context, and especially if you take things from a Western or global context and put it into the Chinese context, there will always be something true or not true about what you say, given the relative context to something else. And this cultural dichotomy of truth is one of the sources of the most frustrating thing foreigners face when they do business in China, and that is circular conversations. Okay, you're trying to get Chinese people to agree on basic facts, but they're not looking at things from the same perspective as you, which means in their perspective, in their cultural context, what you think is true actually is not true. Okay, so that is a cultural dichotomy. Trust is the same thing. Okay, so in Western culture, we generally trust people that we believe are honest. We trust people that are hardworking. We trust people that are generous, and we trust people that are open-minded. You know, these are the types of people we decide whether we want to trust or not. But in Chinese culture, trust has nothing to do with honesty. Okay. In Chinese culture, Chinese people trust people they have deep guanxi relationships with. They trust people that will likely give them face, will likely reciprocate favors, and will likely grant favors when asked because of the guanxi relationship. Okay, so that's a complete cultural dichotomy between how Westerners view who can we trust and who should we not trust. All right, and this gets into truth default theory, which is Westerners have a tendency to trust most people. Okay, obviously we have cultural biases which will affect our trust towards Chinese people, and that's just something that we have to be aware of. But the truth default means that when we're in a community of similar people, Westerners tend to trust people we don't know. Why? Because we believe most people are honest most of the time. That is our truth default. Now, cultural biases aside, when we take that and we go to China, it suddenly will go in the opposite direction where because we have a cultural dichotomy of trust and a cultural dichotomy of truth, we may not trust Chinese people by default. And that is a dangerous thing that you have to be aware of. Chinese people, on the other hand, it's simpler because their truth default is not to trust anyone they don't have guanxi relationships with, including Chinese people. In fact, a lot of Chinese people they sometimes feel foreigners that they don't know or Westerners are actually more trustworthy because of our Chinese people think we're innocent, we're naive, and kind of our naivete makes us less likely to be scheming something in the background. And that will, by default, make us more trustworthy. The key to all of this is just to be more self-aware of how you perceive other people and whether there are negative cultural biases or prejudices, and also be empathetic to what other people might think of you. For example, in my case, I was a paratrooper manager. I was working for a German company, and we sell products that had a lot of design and technology embedded in. And when I was assigned to work in China, first of all, I'm not German. Okay, so they will be skeptical that I had any connections in Germany. I didn't come from the industry, so local Chinese people would be skeptical that I could bring any value as far as understanding the products or understanding the technology. And I wasn't Chinese. So, well, I'm Chinese ethnically, but I'm not from China, which means I'm an American, which means I may or may not really understand how things work in China. Those are the perceptions. And when you have those perceptions, that's all working against you. But the real challenge is because of the Chinese honeymoon period, which we talk about starting with episode 1, is that Chinese people are just accustomed to giving face, especially to foreigners and especially to people who are higher up in the hierarchy, people that they report to. What that means is if you're not empathetic to how they really think and how they really feel, if you lack cultural awareness and self-awareness, people will be giving you face, but you will never really understand how they really think and how they really feel, which is a danger. All right. So this is kind of the situation with Richard. Richard was my highest level direct report in China. He had been with the organization 10 years before I joined, before I was dropped into China as a paratrooper, and suddenly he was reporting to me. All right. So you got to think about it in this context. He had built a really good thing in China for himself. Okay. He was the first salesperson hired by this German company. And basically, he is the person that every German trusted and led the sales organization in China for 10 years. Okay. So suddenly, my presence to him is a threat. Why? Because if he was doing anything that could even remotely be perceived as corrupt or unethical, this new guy, which is me, might try to interfere with whatever he had going on. Okay. He had developed the entire sales organization. He established all the customer relationships. Whenever product managers or design engineers from Germany would go visit customers, or key account managers would go visit customers in China, he was the translator. He was the advisor. And basically, he would orchestrate all of these meetings by preparing both sides, which means the outcome was already predetermined. What he was doing was he left all of the Germans who would go visit customers or try to understand what was going on in China with the impressions that were most favorable to him. Okay. Think about that for a second. He could 100% control the narratives coming out of the China market for all of the decision makers, even in China and in Germany. So he was 100% controlling the narrative, and he would control it in a way that was most favorable to him. Whether there were problems or issues or not, he would have solutions to solve them, or he would have recommendations that basically the company had to follow because they had no other points of view. Now, when I was dropped into China as someone who has China experience, as someone who actually speaks China and understands what's going on in China, if Richard and I aren't aligned, then I become a threat. Okay. And so that is something that I was actually aware of, but I thought that our quote unquote guanxi would help remove any possible challenges or issues from his perceived threat of me. In hindsight, that was not the case. Okay. In hindsight, because I took this job, I was hired directly from the CEO in Germany. During my interview process in Germany, I had met with the board of directors or the advisory board in Germany. I had met with all of the C-level people and all of the directors, and they all kind of gave me the green light to try to increase the turnover in Asia and specifically in China. So one of the things that I felt is I had to do things very principled. Okay, so I can remember this in hindsight. So when I started working with Richard and we started communicating and talking about different things, I presented myself to him as someone very principled and someone who was not likely to accept corruption or corrupt activities. So if Richard was doing anything that could possibly be interpreted as corrupt, suddenly I was a threat. Okay. So that's the background. And because I maintain this persona of being very above board, very ethical, very, wanted to do things the right way, wanted to make sure everything was following the policies. That made it, so Richard was trying to fill me out. That made him feel that the more I uncovered about how he did things for the past 10 years, the more likely I would try to change something or perhaps even get him in trouble because now he suddenly reported directly to me. The difference is I'm new and he had been with the company 10 years, which means he had pre-established relationships with all of the higher level people in Germany who used to go on joint sales calls with him because there wasn't anyone between him and the corporate vice president of sales, Mr. Bauer. And that was his psychology. And the problem is I lack the awareness of how important it is to change his psychology. Okay, so in hindsight, what are some of the things that I should have done or that I could have done? And this is why I think this episode is so important, because if you are an expat manager in China, you are no doubt dealing with either people who report to you, who you didn't hire, who were assigned to report to you, or people that are cross-functionally maybe your peers, but they've been doing things a certain way for a long period of time, and suddenly you have to figure something out, okay? So one of the things, and this is probably the most difficult thing, is it's one of the tactics that we talk about in the do's and don'ts of doing business in China. Actually, it's in this. And and you can download this for free. This is a guide. It's called Do's and Don'ts for Doing Business in China. And one of the things that we suggest, the tactics that you can use, because we're all talking about kind of art of war tactics. And I try to describe some of the things that Chinese people do within the context of the art of war, which is to be misleading. Okay, never reveal what your true feelings are, and let people, if somebody wants to be a fool, let that person be a fool, or something like that. So the art of war tactic really is to be deliberately vague. Now, in my case, what was I doing? I was not deliberately vague. I was very specific on what I thought were principles on how I wanted to manage sales. But in hindsight, I shouldn't have been more specific. And if I had a do-over, I think probably instead of what happened, which is Richard was bad-mouthing me and sabotaging me behind my back and eventually forced my departure because I felt it wasn't worth going to battle with him politically. What I could have done, or what I might have done, is presented myself as someone who's corruptible, someone who might be interested in some of these corrupt activities. Okay. The quote that I left in the podcast is, if you leave a door open in China, it doesn't mean you have to walk through it, right? It means if you present yourself as possibly willing to accept some kickbacks or something corrupt, it doesn't mean you actually have to do it. It just means you have to leave the door open. Because one of the lessons in China is, if you close a door, like I did, okay, I can't tolerate any type of corrupt or unethical activities. When you close a door, you will be left stuck on the other side. Okay, and that's what happened to me. I was left stuck on the other side. Okay, so now we're gonna get to some questions in the chat. Okay, so do things like guanxi give and take happen at a diplomatic level, or is it possible for the State Department of countries around the world that might be clueless to have the perspective as you? Okay, so this is an interesting question. One of the biggest challenges we as a global community have right now is the geopolitical relationship between America and China, the leading, most influential superpowers on Earth today. And at a diplomatic level, do people do that? And my answer to that question is, again, I have no idea because I'm not involved in politics. But my impression is it depends on who's there. Because, for example, when our previous president, Donald Trump, was in office, he had his China advisors. And most of his China advisors were what's called kind of China hawks. That means they perceive China as a threat, and they interpret China's actions in a very literal sense. They're doing this, which is bad. They are stealing technology. They are militarizing the islands in the South China Sea. What I think a lot of those advisors fail to include is they don't understand that Chinese view everything in a reciprocal way. So the more deeply you embed yourself in absolute policies of things that you can or cannot accept, and the way that you interpret Chinese activities, it's a reaction. Okay. So the more hardliners you have advising the politics of American diplomacy toward China, the more China will be forced into a hardline position. Now that translates into your personal relationships. Okay, so if we take politics out of this, let's just talk about our personal relationships with the people that we work with in China. And this is the perfect example of what happened with Richard. The more I was perceived as taking a hardline position, the more I was perceived of being inflexible and, from China's point of view, not open-minded, because I have, quote unquote, certain values and principles that I just always follow, the less likely they are to reciprocate. There is a causality between our attitude, mindset, and approach and how Chinese people will respond. And this is why this is a great question. The number one advice of things that you can do to actually achieve a better outcome or a different outcome if you're frustrated is to adjust your own attitude, mindset, and approach, because there is a causality between how Chinese people behave and your attitude and your mindset. And when we get into the story about Jack and goodwill extraction, this is exactly what happened. Okay. We hear a lot of media reports and a lot of articles and a lot of blogs about certain Chinese people behaving poorly. We see it in the news all the time. What we don't realize is that a lot of our actions and a lot of our positions actually forces Chinese people into those alternative, what we would consider bad actions. It's kind of like a default. And if we would have taken a different position, and this is what episode 5, I think, is about, when we talk about my channel partner in China, Jack, who actually started off as someone who was 100% trustworthy, but ended up being someone who, in a literal sense, lied, cheated, and stole from our company. What I'm saying in hindsight is those bad actions were more caused by our approach, our attitude, and our mindset than that over time forced him into other activities, which were, for Chinese people, were natural. You know, if we're not reciprocating the goodwill of our Guanxi relationship, then eventually Chinese people will figure out other places in the Chinese value chain, which only they know, to extract it. It's a negative self-fulfilling prophecy that if you think Chinese people are not trustworthy and will behave poorly, and that is your attitude, and everything you do is try to prevent that, you actually force them into those types of actions even more. All right, so we got another question in the chat. Do other nations like Japan or Korea have similar ways of interacting with China? If Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un were negotiating, would there be a honeymoon period? So other nations, yes, they have a completely different way of negotiating. Now, when you talk about Japan and South Korea, they're obviously democratic and they're more aligned with Western values. All right. But they would have a different approach towards China than America. That's completely natural. Now, which way works better is debatable. Okay. There is nothing to suggest that America's approach to foreign policy is the best. In fact, I think America's approach towards China needs to be changed dramatically. And so if people in positions of authority in the US government ever listen to these podcasts, I hope that they will find that if they adjust their attitude, they could get a different result. And that's wolf warrior diplomacy aside. Now, as far as Kim Jong-un in North Korea, that's a completely different story, because North Korea and China are much more alike in the way they think, and their relationship is based completely on their legacy history of together. North Koreans and mainland Chinese fought all of the imperial invaders together. They fought South Korea. They fought Japan. They fought the Americans. So they are tied that way by history. And so this is, again, not a history lesson. It's not a history podcast. It's not a political podcast. But a lot of these things are interesting to put into context. Why Chinese people that you interact with for business may think or feel a certain way. All right. So if there's any more questions, please post them in the chat. If you go back and you listen to the podcast and you come back and listen to this replay, you can always type comments on the video. I will respond to all of those comments. Otherwise, I just want to thank everybody for attending and listening. I know that when you have new content, it's really hard to reach a larger audience and to start building a following and to get more people to understand what you are trying to accomplish. So if you're on this podcast, if you enjoy the episodes that you're listening to, please share them with your friends. Share them with other people and just say, hey, this podcast is trying to do this. And do you guys know what this podcast is trying to do? It's helping you understand how Chinese people think, how they feel, and why they behave the way they do, so you can make an adjustment to your attitude, mindset, and approach in order to change the interaction patterns that you have with the people that you're working with. If you are frustrated, this is a way to not have the same frustrating conversations every single time. This is a way for you to change those patterns of interaction into something more positive and more productive. This is a way for you to, instead of react, to try to prevent Chinese people from behaving badly. This is a way for you to be proactive and help Chinese people work with you in a more productive and constructive manner. So thank you for being here. If you enjoyed it, again, please share it with other people. Try to get more people in the conversation. I love the questions that are coming in, and any feedback is always welcome. This is season 1 of the China Myth podcast. You have just finished listening to episode 4, Art of War, Deception, or Trust During a Chinese Honeymoon Period. What are some of the signs that this is happening? And look forward to next week where we're going to recap episode 5. All right. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to seeing you soon. Again, continue to drop your questions in the chat. I'll answer them as best I can as soon as they are received.